Torin read decay curves before she read anything else. She had run picket rotations for the Outer Perimeter Authority for 19 cycles, long enough to stop trusting almost any number in a personnel file except the one that mattered most for the job. How fast a sentry's attention degraded when nothing was happening. Reflexes could be trained. Threat recognition could be drilled into a recruit until it was closer to instinct than knowledge. But the slow, grinding erosion of attention across an 11-hour watch in a station where nothing moved for weeks at a time, that was not trainable, not past a narrow margin. And Torin had built her entire posting philosophy around the belief that the erosion curve was the truest thing a file could tell her about a person before the person had any say in the matter. The Vigilance Decay Index measured exactly this. How much a subject's signal detection accuracy dropped, hour over hour, during long stretches of low-stimulus monitoring. A species with a steep decay curve caught almost everything in the first 90 minutes of a shift and missed a rising share of everything after that, the attention guttering the way a flame guttered when the air around it thinned. A species with a shallow curve held closer to its starting accuracy longer, though no verified species in authority record, across the full historical dataset going back to the founding of the Picket program, had ever posted a decay rate flat enough to be called negligible across a full standard watch. Every curve fell. The only question the index was built to answer was how far and how fast. This cycle's intake for the Kestrel line, 6 remote listening posts strung along a stretch of contested boundary, where nothing interesting had happened in 3 years, and where the authority nonetheless insisted on staffing every post at full strength, because the one time something interesting did happen, it happened without warning and without patience for understaffed posts. Torin reviewed the 11 incoming sentries in registration order, which put the 2 human recruits last. A fact she noted the way she noted most administrative coincidences. Briefly, and without assigning it a significance it had not earned. The files ahead of the humans told her nothing surprising. A Denhal recruit with a decay index of 6.4, unremarkable for the species. A curve that dropped hard after the second hour and required a rotation schedule with breaks built in at the 90-minute mark, which was standard and easy to plan around. A Corvi recruit posting 4.9, better than average, the kind of number that let Torin assign her to the longer, lonelier posts without worry. A pair of Ashen twins with near-identical curves, which was unremarkable, since Ashen biology produced twins with near-identical everything down to the decay rate of their attention. She flagged the Denhal file for Post 3's rotation supervisor, who disliked adjusting the standard schedule on principle, and would say so, briefly, in the tone he used for administrative inconveniences that were not, in the end, actual problems. Torin had never pointed out that his objection and his compliance always arrived together, in that order, because the objecting never once slowed down the complying, and she saw no benefit in treating something that was not a problem as though it were one. She moved on. The human files arrived in their place at the end. The first, a recruit named Devin Okafor, posted an unremarkable 5.1, competent, forgettable, the kind of number that would let him serve out a full posting without anyone needing to think about him twice, which was its own kind of compliment in this line of work. She closed the file and opened the second. Sentry recruit Naledi Achebe, human, first-year rotation candidate, physical metrics unremarkable, well within recorded human baseline, reaction time within expected range. None of that concerned Torin particularly. Physical panels had never been where the interesting part of a listening post file lived. What concerned her, what stopped her mid-review the way a stopped clock stopped a room, was the decay curve. The raw scan showed a signal detection accuracy that held above 90% through the full 11-hour test window, dropping by less than 4 points across the entire simulated shift. A curve so shallow, so nearly flat, that it fell well outside every recorded baseline the authorities' instruments had ever produced for any species, human or otherwise. No verified reading in the historical dataset had ever come close. The scanner flagged it as it was built to, reading inconsistent with all recorded species decay baselines, probable sensor drift or test condition anomaly during intake simulation, normalized per standard protocol to nearest plausible species adjusted curve. Below the flag in the field that would govern her actual post assignment and every subsequent supervisor's expectations of her, A decay index of 5.3. An entirely ordinary number, one that would place her in the unremarkable middle of the intake cohort and require no further attention from anyone, including, in that moment, Toran. Toran looked at the correction the way she had looked at 10,000 corrections before it. A system doing exactly what it had been designed to do, encountering a reading at the extreme edge of the plausible and resolving the anomaly toward the middle of the distribution rather than trusting the edge. She had not written the underlying clause. It predated her posting by 2 rotation directors, but she had reviewed its logic during her own certification and found it sound. Anomalies that far outside every historical baseline were, in her professional experience, almost always artifacts of a miscalibrated instrument rather than genuine outliers, and treating a false outlier as real cost you nothing you could afford to lose next to the cost of trusting an artifact and distorting an entire rotation's comparative planning. This was correct procedure. She accepted the override and continued, noting only, out of the same habit that made her read biographical addenda last rather than skip them, that Achebe's file listed 6 years of prior civilian service on a coastal search and rescue crew that ran overnight watches for vessels in distress, work that the addendum described in its characteristically dry phrasing as requiring recruits to remain functionally alert across shifts with a near-total absence of actionable signal for the great majority of their duration. Turan read this, filed it as the kind of human biographical detail that was exact and probably beside the point, and moved to the next file. The Kestrel line settled into its new rotation the way every rotation settled, unevenly, with the early friction of sentries learning which of their postmates could be trusted to hold a channel steady through the dead hours, and which needed checking on more often than the schedule technically required. Toran did not intervene in this sorting. It was, in her experience, a thing the sentries worked out for themselves, and a supervisor who tried to accelerate it usually only got in the way. Post 5 ran its scheduled proficiency drill in the 6th week, a controlled, low-stakes exercise the authority ran at every post on a staggered cycle, injecting a faint, deliberately ambiguous signal into the monitoring feed at an unannounced point in the shift to test whether sentries caught it, and, more importantly, whether they caught it consistently regardless of how far into the shift the injection happened to land. The drill's design had not changed in longer than Toran had held her post, on the theory that if the drill itself never varied, any variance in outcome could be attributed cleanly to the sentries. Achebe drew a standard 11-hour watch, paired at the post with Okafor and a Corvi sentry named Ressa. Toran monitored the feed remotely from the line's coordination hub, with the raw, uncorrected detection telemetry open on a side panel. Data the drill software retained for its own internal calibration purposes, and that supervisors were never required to consult, since the corrected, cohort-comparable scores were the ones that actually governed staffing decisions. She opened it anyway, out of the same habit that made her read addenda rather than skip them. Some habits earned their keep rarely and paid off enormously on the occasions they did. The drill injected its faint signal at the 9-hour mark, deep into the shift, in the window where every recorded species curve predicted the steepest drop in detection accuracy. Okafor's telemetry did what a 5.1 decay curve reliably did, a detection delay of several seconds past the drill's benchmark, well within tolerance, entirely consistent with his file. Ressa's Corvi curve held slightly better, as her file predicted it would, catching the signal close to the benchmark window. Both sentries performed exactly as their numbers said they would, which was, in its own quiet way, satisfying to watch, the numbers behaving as numbers were supposed to. Achebe caught the injected signal in under 4 seconds, faster, in fact, than the median detection time recorded across the entire cohort's earlier, less fatigued first-hour drills. Her telemetry across the full 9 hours preceding the injection showed a detection baseline that had barely moved from where it started the shift. A curve so shallow, it looked, on the side panel, less like data and more like an instrument, reading the same value repeatedly, out of malfunction. Toran checked the sensor status twice out of reflex before accepting that the sensor was functioning correctly, and the flatness was the finding, not the fault. She made a note in the margin of the drill report. Detection performance consistent with corrected decay index of 5.3. strong result. A recruit performing near the top end of the range her corrected score predicted was, on its face, a good outcome, and not an anomalous one. Torin closed the note and moved on to the next post's debrief because a good outcome was not, on its own, a thing that demanded further scrutiny, and she had learned across 19 cycles not to manufacture significance out of results that were, as far as the record showed, simply results. Between the 6th week and the 11th, Torin had 2 further occasions to glance at Post 5's numbers, both unremarkable, both filed without comment. The first was a routine equipment audit that required every post to log a full shift of baseline telemetry, regardless of whether anything of interest occurred during it. Standard maintenance procedure. The authority ran on a rolling schedule so that instrument drift could be caught before it compounded into something that mattered. Achebe's baseline came back within acceptable tolerance of the drill result from 3 weeks prior. The same shallow curve, the same handful of points of drop across the full shift. Torin noted the consistency and moved on, because consistency in a baseline was on its own a good outcome rather than an anomalous one, and she had learned not to manufacture significance out of numbers that simply kept agreeing with themselves. The second occasion was smaller and in retrospect more telling than Torin gave it credit for at the time. Post 5's rotation supervisor, a Denhal named Ostrin who ran a tight schedule and disliked deviations from it on the same general principle that made him grumble about adjusted breaks, submitted a minor staffing request in the 9th week, asking whether Achebe could be moved to cover the post's least popular rotation, the back half of the graveyard shift, the stretch every sentry on the line privately regarded as the worst assignment available. Not because it was dangerous, since nothing on the Kestrel line had been dangerous in 3 years, but because it was long, dark, and almost entirely without incident, the kind of shift that ground down even a well-rested sentry's patience, hour by hour. Ostrin's request cited, in the dry administrative language such requests were always written in, that Achebe had expressed no preference against the assignment and had, on informal observation, shown no measurable difference in performance between early and late portions of comparable shifts. Torin approved the request without particular thought, filing it as a minor scheduling convenience rather than as the second independent confirmation of the intake anomaly that it actually was. She would return to this specific request 11 weeks later, after the incursion, and find it sitting in the record exactly where it had always been, unremarkable and entirely correct, waiting for someone to notice that it had been telling her something the whole time. 11 weeks later, it stopped being a drill. The failure that preceded it was as mundane as failures in this line of work usually were, and drills almost never bothered to be, not an injected signal with a designed resolution, but an actual unregistered vessel, running dark, drifting into the Kestrel line's outer detection envelope during the specific stretch of a rotation that every historical baseline in Torin's files agreed was the least likely window for any sentry, of any species, to be operating anywhere near full attentiveness. Hour 10 of an 11-hour graveyard shift, deep in the flattest, most signal-starved part of the watch, the stretch every decay curve on record predicted would be furthest along its downward slope. Post 5 was fully staffed that night with Achebe, Okafor, and Ressa, none of whom had any advance reason to expect anything other than the 11 hours of near-total quiet the post had produced on every comparable night for the preceding 3 years. The vessel's drive signature was faint by design, running at a power output calibrated to sit just below the threshold. Most standard monitoring protocols treat it as background noise, not invisible, but close enough to invisible that catching it required a sentry actively parsing the noise floor, rather than passively waiting for something loud enough to announce itself. Torin reviewed the post's full internal recording afterward, hour by hour, and understood within the first pass through hour 10 why the vessel had chosen that specific window to attempt its approach. Whoever had planned the incursion had access to authority decay curve data, or a close enough approximation of it, and had built their timing around the near-universal assumption that hour 10 of a graveyard shift was the hour every sentry on the boundary would be furthest from their best. Achebe flagged the signature at 9 minutes past the hour 10 mark, on a monitoring channel 2 full detection thresholds below, where the automated system itself was configured to raise an alert. She did not wait for the system. She pulled the raw feed manually, cross-referenced it against 3 hours of background variance she had apparently been tracking without any instruction to do so, and called it to Post 5's channel in the same flat, unhurried register the recording captured at every other hour of the shift, no different at minute 9 of hour 10 than it had been at minute 9 of hour 1. Drive signature, bearing 294, sub-threshold but consistent, not drift. Someone's running dark and matching our noise floor on purpose. She had the post's full detection suite reconfigured to track the bearing before Okafor, roused from a shift already well past its expected attention trough, had finished asking her to repeat it. The vessel altered course the moment it registered the post's tracking lock, aborting whatever approach it had planned, and burning hard back toward the boundary's unmonitored dark, too far gone within minutes for intercept, but logged, flagged, and reported up the line with enough data attached that the authorities' boundary command opened a full incursion investigation before the shift had even ended. Ressa roused a full 10 minutes after Okafor and considerably more disoriented for it. Later told the debriefing panel that she had assumed, in the first confused seconds after the alert, that the post had simply run a surprise drill without warning her. The situation had the shape of one, the calm procedural cadence of Achebe's voice on the channel matching, almost exactly, the cadence of every drill briefing Ressa had sat through since intake. It was only when Boundary Command's confirmation came back, 20 minutes later, that the vessel had been real, unregistered, and actively evading pursuit, that Ressa understood the difference had never been in how Achebe sounded. There had been no difference. That was, in its own way, the entire finding, the entire. Toran, reviewing the incident report the following morning, found herself reading the same telemetry panel she had glanced at once, 11 weeks earlier, during a routine drill, filed as consistent, and closed without a second thought. She pulled the full communications log from the incident, then the drill, and set them beside each other out of the same instinct that had made her open the raw feed in the first place, instead of trusting the corrected summary. The two recordings of Achebe's voice, separated by 11 weeks and by the difference between a scripted exercise and an unregistered vessel actually running dark along a contested boundary, were, as far as Toran's trained ear could determine across 3 careful passes, indistinguishable from one another in every measure that mattered. Toran pulled the post's full internal recording that night, with the same uncorrected instrument panel open that the drill software had made available to her 11 weeks before. Detection accuracy across the full 10 hours preceding the incident, a curve that had barely moved from its starting value, the same near-flat line the drill had produced, the same line Toran had on that earlier occasion, checked twice for sensor malfunction before accepting it as real, and then, having accepted it, filing it as unremarkable rather than as the finding it plainly was. The corrected file, the one every rotation supervisor and staffing system on the line had access to, said 5.3. The post's internal recording said something else entirely. The same something else the drill had quietly said 11 weeks earlier, when Toran had looked directly at the raw feed, found it consistent with the number she already expected to see, and moved on to the next post's debrief without asking why a genuine outlier and an instrument malfunction should have looked on the page exactly the same. She pulled the original intake scan and set it beside the incident recording, the 2 files open in adjacent panels on her desk display. The raw decay curve at intake had shown less than 4 points of drop across a full 11-hour simulated window, normalized at the time to a corrected index of 5.3 on the grounds that no verified species reading had ever come close to that flatness before. The post-recording from the incident showed a drop of just under 3 points across 9 full hours of an actual unscripted, unrehearsed shift. No correction applied to it at all, because there had been no scanner present in that listening post to apply one, only the honest, unmediated record of what an actual sentry's attention had actually done across 9 hours. Nobody had told her in advance would matter. The 2 curves agreed with each other closely, nearly exactly. They had, Toran now understood, agreed with each other from the very first day. It was only the correction sitting between them, imposed at intake, 11 weeks before either curve had been permitted to speak for itself under conditions nobody controlled. That had never once been true. She returned to the calibration protocol governing the correction, the version she had inherited rather than authored, drafted 2 rotation directors before her posting by someone who had established, with entirely reasonable confidence given the dataset available at the time, that no species decay curve could plausibly fall below a certain floor, without the reading being attributable to instrument error, on the simple grounds that no verified reading ever had. The clause had held for longer than Torin had occupied her post. It had never once produced a documented false negative in the historical record, which was precisely why no one before her had gone looking for the specific kind of wrong it turned out to be capable of being. A rule that has never failed you does not announce its own fragility. It simply keeps working, rotation after rotation, until the population it was built to describe changes underneath it, without telling anyone filing the paperwork. The scanner, Torin now understood with the clarity that arrived only after the fact, had not malfunctioned during HFY's intake in any sense that mattered. It had recorded, with complete instrumental accuracy, an attention system that registered the same signal detection accuracy at hour 10 that it had at hour 1. Not because nothing was costing her anything to sustain it. The addendum's 6 years of overnight search and rescue watches suggested rather strongly that it had cost her a great deal, over a great many years, to build a mind capable of that flatness. But because whatever the cost had been, it had already been paid, long before intake, in a way the instrument had never previously needed to model. Nothing in the historical dataset had required a category for a decay curve that had already been trained flat by years of exactly this kind of watch, because nothing in the historical dataset had ever included anyone who'd spent 6 years doing it as unpaid, unglamorous civilian work before an authority scanner ever got a look at her. She thought of Okafor's shift-worn attention dipping right on schedule at hour 10, and Ressa's Corvi curve doing precisely what a Corvi curve reliably did, both of them producing textbook, thoroughly unremarkable decay profiles exactly where the historical baseline predicted and understood that the flatness floor built into the protocol had never been a law describing attention in general. It was a law describing every decay curve the instrument had happened to be shown before this particular recruit. HFY's had simply never been part of the sample the floor was built from, and nothing in the protocol had ever been designed to notice when the sample stopped being complete. Torin opened the calibration document and found the clause exactly where memory told her it would be. Readings below the established floor are to be attributed to instrument variance and normalized to the nearest plausible species-adjusted curve. She sat with the word plausible for a long moment. It had been doing considerably more work in that single sentence than anyone who had written it, or anyone who had inherited it since, had ever asked it to do out loud. She deleted the clause. In its place she wrote 3 lines, administrative in tone, unremarkable in register, filed through the same channel as every other minor amendment she had submitted across 19 cycles, though she suspected this one would outlast most of them. Readings falling below the established floor were to be preserved unaltered in the primary record, flagged individually for direct supervisor review rather than automatic correction, and never again normalized silently toward a species average that had, on inspection, never actually been supported by anything beyond the fact that nothing flatter had come along yet. The flag, she wrote, was not the error. The flag had never once been the error. It had simply been waiting, patiently and without complaint, for someone on the other end of it to stop assuming that it was. She found Achebe in the post's small galley the following morning, off shift, drinking something dark out of a chipped mug and watching the same monitoring displays she'd been watching all night, out of habit rather than obligation. The shift long since handed to Ressa's relief. The vessel's logged as a confirmed incursion attempt, Torin said. Boundary Command is treating it as the first credible probe of this stretch of the line in 3 years. Figured as much, from how many people wanted the recording this morning. Achebe didn't look up from the display right away. Did I get someone in trouble? I flagged it 2 thresholds below the automated cutoff. I know that's not exactly following the letter of the monitoring protocol. You didn't get anyone in trouble. You got the protocol corrected. Torin sat, which was not something she typically did in post galleys, on the theory that a supervisor who sat with sentries outside formal debriefs blurred a line worth keeping clean. She sat anyway. Your decay index was corrected at intake. From a raw reading, the calibration protocol treated as an instrument error because no reading that flat had ever been verified before. Was it wrong? No, Toran said. It was accurate. The protocol simply had no category for what it was accurately describing, and so it adjusted the number until the number fit a category that already existed. I've filed an amendment removing that clause. Your corrected index will be reissued to reflect the original curve, and the change will be logged as a correction to an error in evaluation, not a correction to you. Achebe considered this, turning the mug slowly in her hands. Practically speaking, supervisors will stop scheduling your breaks around an hour 10 trough that was never actually there, and start expecting the shift you actually demonstrated last night, which will mean considerably less margin for anything short of it going forward. It is not, on balance, a favor. Toran thought of the recording once more. 9 minutes past a threshold no automated system had thought worth raising. An instruction called across the channel in a voice that had not once slowed down for anyone's expectation of what hour 10 was supposed to sound like. But it will mean the number in your file finally agrees with the sentry that post already knew you were. Achebe nodded slowly and did not smile, and did not look particularly pleased with herself, which struck Toran as entirely consistent with everything the file, the real one, the one that no longer required rounding down to fit a curve that had never described her in the first place, had been quietly saying about her since the day someone first decided not to believe it. For what it's worth, Toran added, standing, Ostrin's request to move you onto the back half of the graveyard rotation went through in the 9th week. I approved it without reading past the summary line. I wanted on record that I very nearly filed the correct assignment for the wrong reason, and got the right outcome anyway, which is not something I intend to make a habit of relying on. Achebe allowed herself finally something close to a smile, small and brief and entirely without triumph in it. For what it's worth, I didn't apply for it because I wanted the hard shift. I applied because it was the one nobody else wanted, and somebody had to be good at it eventually, and it might as well have been someone who'd already spent 6 years finding out she could be. She turned the mug once more in her hands, watching the display where the boundary's outer envelope sat quiet again, the vessel long gone, the record of it filed and closing. The water back home didn't care whether you'd had a bad watch or a good one. It came in on its own schedule regardless. You learned to be the same on the theory that the alternative was worse. Toran had no immediate answer to that, and did not attempt to manufacture one. She left the amendment where it stood, in the queue, unremarkable in form and, she suspected, considerable in consequence, and went to begin the slower work of finding out how many other flagged readings across 19 cycles of picket rotations had been quietly rounded down to fit a curve that had simply never been asked to include the person it was describing.